Well, hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, From Alpha to Beta, Coaching the Post-Heroic Leader. My name is Stephanie Gerard, and I'm the Manager of Education, Research, and Marketing here at the Institute of Coaching. And I am absolutely delighted to be welcoming our guest presenter, colleague, and friend, Dr. Jeffrey Hull. Jeff is one of the amazing leaders at the Institute of Coaching, and he is also an author, educator, and consultant with over 20 years experience partnering with C-suite executives on issues such as high-performance leadership, change management, organizational strategy, structure, and culture. Jeff is also a highly sought-after facilitator, keynote speaker, and executive coach to both nonprofit and for-profit global organizations. He's the CEO of Leadershift, which is a management consultancy based in New York City, and a clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, and an adjunct professor of leadership at New York University. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be moderating the presentation for Jeff today, and I cannot wait to learn from him amongst our group of participants today. Before I pass the spotlight over to Jeff, I'd like to make a few housekeeping notes. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send them to us via the webinar question or chat function, and Jeff will try to respond to your questions at various periods of the presentation. Due to the high participation today, all attendee audio has been muted to avoid any background noise. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available along with the slides as a resource on the Institute of Coaching website. Following the webinar, and again tomorrow by email, you will be prompted to complete a survey. If you wish to receive any CEUs, completion of the survey is required, and we welcome and look forward to any and all feedback that you can provide us. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jeff.
So thank you, Stephanie, for that slightly embarrassing introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar here at the Institute of Coaching, wherever you are. Where I'm sitting, it is exactly 12 noon, so middle of the day here in New York City. And surprisingly, it's still spring. I don't know what's going on with the weather, but it's like almost 60 degrees here. So we're trying to enjoy it as long as we can because we know it won't last. I am thrilled to be here. It's great fun for me to do a presentation for our webinar this month. I've had the opportunity with Stephanie to moderate these webinars over the last year or two on occasion, and it's always really enjoyable to work with different thought leaders. So this is our chance to kind of have some fun together, I guess, toward the end of the year. And Stephanie and I are going to do this webinar together, so I'm going to ask her to feel free to, Steph, you can hear me, right?
I sure can.
So I'm going to ask you to play with me and interrupt me. And what I'd love to do as much as possible is take questions at various pause points during the webinar, but also throughout the webinar. Having been a moderator and listened in to a number of webinars over the years, I realize that this whole webinar format, as wonderful as it is, has sort of its pluses and minuses. Because it often feels kind of like you're listening to a disembodied voice out in the middle of nowhere. And I've been on a number of webinars where they've tried to have people on video, and I was recently on one with the International Leadership Association where they had us all unmuted and we were all talking, and it's just kind of a catch-22 because everybody was interacting, but on the other hand you couldn't really hear anything because there was so much noise in the background. So I think our way of doing them here at the Institute has been to keep everyone pretty much on mute during the presentation, and that of course limits the way we can interact with each other, which is a little bit frustrating, but what I'm going to try to do is to take questions as often as possible. So I've given Stephanie permission to interrupt me and to kind of go back and forth, and also to share in the chat box. I think you all have a chat box in your webinar screen, and to share thoughts as they come up I should be able to read them, and Stephanie will be able to read them, and maybe we can comment as we go along. So we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. And then if we have a little bit of time at the end, and I'm going to try to watch the time, I'm not always good at that, but I'm going to do my best, to maybe even do some unmutes where we can unmute a few of you to have you be able to chat with us directly. So we're going to be a little bit experimental and see if we can break through that cyberspace paradigm. So let's see. Let's jump into my goals for this webinar. So the title, From Alpha to Beta, Coaching the Post-Heroic Leader. It kind of comes, if we look at the goals that I've put together for this, this all stems from a journey that I've been on over the last 20 years that sort of culminated in developing, with the help of some graduate students, a framework that I'm now currently using with a number of my clients, especially clients that are millennials, so-called, taking up leadership roles, which is becoming more and more common. So let me just quickly share the way I've hopefully framed this time together for us. These goals are initially to be able to describe how the rise of millennials, the joining of millennials into the managerial ranks, is bringing about a fundamental reevaluation of what it means to be a high quality or competent leader. And I think it's safe to say that if you look at the generational evolution, that most people consider millennials to be those people born around between the time of 1980 and the year 2000. There's a lot of debate. Some people say 1984 to the year 2000, but I would say most generations are in a 20-year framework. So if you think about that, that means that some of the millennials are now emerging in their late 20s and early 30s into leadership roles. So for those of us that are doing coaching in leadership, we're beginning to see the impact of that. Also, there's been the second goal for me today is to look at how the evolution of scientific research, the evidence-based underpinnings of what it takes to be an effective leader, has also evolved greatly in the last 20 years or so. And that's, in a way, catching up with the change of the guard, so to speak, with the millennials. And then finally, it's helpful for those of us that are working with millennial leaders to begin to have frameworks and practices that support us in being more able to help them through the transition of what I'm considering to be, and I think many of us are considering to be, a fairly big paradigm change in the leadership world in terms of what it takes to be an effective leader in today's organizations. So those are the goals that I have for us to set today. And before I jump too far into that, I think I'd like to sort of step back for one second and just briefly share a little bit of a story of how this all came to happen for me personally. I think, I was sharing with some friends of mine about this presentation and this work that I've been doing over the last few years. And one of them said to me, "So Jeff, why is this so important to you? Why do you care about this?" And I thought, that's a really valuable question. I'm often on a lot of these webinars, and I don't, we love getting the thought leadership of the experts, so to speak. But I think many times I often wonder, where do these people come to have their passion? Like, how did they come into that space and decide to focus on that particular theme? So I think what I'd like to do is just take a minute, and many of you that have been involved with the Institute may have had a chance to meet me or get to know me through other workshops and say hello at the conference. But for those of you that are hearing from me maybe for the first time, a quick story about my background, just to sort of set some context. When I was about 30-ish years old, which is quite a while ago, when I was a millennial, I guess, before there were millennials, I had the opportunity to work at a consulting firm, which shall remain nameless, but it was one of the bigger management consulting firms at the time. And I was in the human resource field, so I was a director of HR, and I had up until that point a number of really good bosses, But to make a long story short, I had, I guess, what I'd call a very difficult, in fact, maybe verging on abrasive or toxic leader. And it became a real crucible moment for me in my career because as the director of HR, I found that it was extremely painful to have a boss who was a partner with this firm who was, shall we say, less than friendly. He was extremely difficult. He was berating people. He was sort of the true old paradigm autocrat. And I got caught up in a situation where I really took it on to try to coach him. And because his behavior was pretty extreme. I won't share too many stories. I won't share any of the painful stories, but let's just say that he took pride in doing things like making people cry, and he would often turn to me and say, "Jeff, did I do a good job?" And I would say, "Well, you know, the fact that you just screamed at people and they're now in tears doesn't seem to me to be a good job." So ultimately, I tried to coach him, and I failed, and it didn't change. It got very painful, and long story short, I decided to leave that environment. But that set me on a journey. It set me to start researching leadership and to try to learn what was going on in the leadership world so that I could become more effective at coaching people like him. And as far back as the mid-90s, there's a lot of research that was being done to change the paradigm. There were books out called The New Paradigm of Business, and Margaret Wheatley had done a book called Leadership and the New Science. So there was research available to help leaders transition from being sort of that old paradigm, patriarchal, tough guy, to being perhaps a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more empathetic, a little bit more emotionally intelligent. But at that time, it really hadn't taken hold. And so for me personally, it really started me on the journey to where I am now, which is I'm very excited to see that some of the science that's been developed and is now hitting the mainstream is actually becoming the norm. So I share that story because it's really what set me on the path to, excuse me, to work with leaders, and it's led me to being very, very excited today to find that as I'm working with more and more of what we're calling sort of the next generation of leaders, not that the boomers themselves haven't come around or the Gen Xers haven't come around and actually evolved greatly, but I'm really noticing that here we are about 20 years later, and this new emerging cohort, very large group of leaders is really fundamentally changing the way leadership works in America and organizations work. And I think we're all being impacted, and I think it's a really exciting, wonderful thing. And what I'm excited is to sort of finally see the science, the evidence, and the coaching all begin to catch up with what's going on in the leadership world. So with that, let's jump into where I am today with working with millennials. This work that I've been doing with millennials is sort of a convergence of a couple of different streams. One is that the framework that I'm going to share today comes from my work at NYU, where I've been doing graduate teaching in the leadership program in their master's degree in business and in marketing analytics. And in that program, I would say about 90% of the students are millennials. So I'm actually getting to interact with a number of people that are in their late 20s, early 30s. They are stepping into leadership roles. They're very excited about being leaders. And they're also challenging the norms. They're pushing up against, you know, those of us that are still in the traditionalist boomer Generation X kinds of leadership roles where we may hold the power in the organizations, but the world is changing. So I have here a list of what I consider to be sort of the key descriptors of what we're seeing evolve with these millennials. And this comes partly from my own research working with millennials in the classroom, Also, the other stream is that as we'll see as I go through this, starting to coach millennials. So that's where primarily I'm starting to see leadership coaching show up in my work with millennial leaders. And then finally, the research that's out in the field, and I have some resources at the end of this presentation, articles from Harvard Business Review and other areas where a number of people have done some substantial research on this millennial generation and beginning to really be able to encapsulate the difference that they're seeing in the way millennials not only view leadership now, but how they frame themselves, how they think of themselves as leaders, but the way they're pushing to change the entire organizational structure. So as I'm going through this, Stephanie, are you there? You want to take the quick poll?
Yeah, I think that would be a great time for that.
So we were thinking, I'm taking a quick drink here, that as I go through this slide, we'd love to just get your input to see how many of the folks that are on the call are actually coaching millennials, like the beginnings of folks that are in their late 20s and early 30s, mid 30s, kind of on the cusp of Generation X. So how many of you have found yourself beginning to coach millennial leaders? And I guess you can either raise your hand. How does that work, Steph?
Well, we're getting the results in right now, and let me share it.
Okay.
Can you see that on your screen?
So about 70% of the folks on the call are beginning to get engagements with millennial leaders. And the second question, obvious follow-up to that, is if you're seeing a change in the way, what it means to coach as a leadership coach. You're seeing a distinction in the coaching style, the requirements, the needs. Do you have the second question?
Yeah. Yes, I'm just about to launch it. Here we go.
Great. So are you finding millennial leaders to be different? And as we're going through this, please pop questions that come into your mind or comments. And Stephanie's been given total permission to interrupt me when I'm on a roll.
I do have one. So after we close this poll, so
Okay.
Here you go. Similar result.
Oh, great. So this is helpful for me because my colleagues at the Institute of Coaching, we've talked about this. My colleagues that I work with in some of the consulting firms coaching firms have also started to notice a difference. But I'm seeing, so about 70% of you are seeing some change in the way you're doing your coaching. So I think we're onto something here.
And Jeff, I'll just start off with one question.
Sure.
Do you find these narratives that you were just speaking of to be generally globally applicable, or are there cultural differences?
Wow, great question. You know, I have to say yes and yes, right? In the sense that from a generational standpoint, I think there are, well, it's interesting. We're going to keep that question in mind when I get to my next slide because we're going to talk about convergence. And I'm finding that cultural differences and global differences are becoming both present in the evolution of these in the impact of, and the ways of operating of these younger leaders, but they're also maybe receding a little bit into the background. So let's hold on to that. Keep that question alive, Stephanie, okay?
Okay.
Remind me, because it's actually on something I'm going to mention in the next slide, but it's a great question.
And Jeff, I do have one more just about the value, and maybe this is something to think about as we go along, but very specifically, are you finding that organizations are willing to pay for meaningful coaching engagements for these millennials?
That's a really good question too. So here's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that in companies that are run by millennials, like some of the startups and the younger companies, so companies that are just a few years old, I'm currently working, and I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of fast growth companies where millennials are really in the true leadership roles, where they're in the C-suite. Those companies are very excited about investing in leadership development, and they are very comfortable with coaching. Now, at some of the larger companies where you still have, and more traditional firms, where you still have the traditionalists or the boomers running the firm, In many cases, you're still running into that issue where the senior people may get coaching and may get leadership development, but the folks in the middle and at the lower levels, it's still a little bit more hierarchical and there's still a challenge. I'm finding, though, that this is something that the boomers are having to contend with, that the millennials are pushing up and saying, hey, don't wait. I don't want to wait till I've been here 20 years before I get a coach. I want to start to have impact now. And it varies. I would say it depends on the culture of the organization, the size of the organization, and whether or not they are more structured or more flexible. And that actually is a great question. Thanks, Steph. It jumps right into this list of what I'm seeing as the shift in the narrative around the way millennials view their roles and the way they view leadership. So, you know, if you think the very first thing is really key, which is there's less respect for hierarchy. And that doesn't mean that the organizations that millennials are leading in don't have hierarchy. Obviously, there's a need for people to have management structures and have a need for direction, but there's much less of a desire to get caught up in a siloed, climbing the ladder kind of environment. People are very early in their career wanting personal and career growth. They want to have meaningful work, and they're not so much focused on the position or the title or moving up the ladder so much as they are concerned with having being challenged and having meaningful work. And then if you think about, if you jump down on this slide to areas of flexibility, and interconnectivity, you know, this idea of the hierarchy starting to dissipate or become less of a focus is also being impacted by the way millennials communicate. And to a certain extent, we're all impacted by this, right? We're all connecting more through the social media, through the smartphones, but what that means is that direct connection with leaders is much more fluid than it was in the past. So many of my clients are running into opportunities and challenges with these hierarchical issues of wanting to connect directly with the top and not have to go through layers. So it works both ways. Sometimes it's beneficial because it cuts through the layers, and people that have ideas and people that want to have an impact can use the technology to be directly connected to senior people, and they can have direct influence on the organization. But it also creates issues of transparency and power dynamics with some of the senior people who are, wait a minute, I've been here for 20 years and now someone 3 levels below me is sending me a text message. So you can get a sense of how wonderful it is to have this sort of flatter, interconnected, more mobile interaction with people, but you can also see how it creates complications. And then if we shift a little bit to the broader scope, let me move to the next slide. Oops. Yeah. What I'm seeing is that this whole move toward millennials in a leadership role is also part and parcel of a bigger process that I've mentioned some of the keys to that. And a question, Stephanie, that you asked me about global and cultural narratives connects to this. So I've just listed just a few things here. What I'm kind of pointing to as what I'm calling the age of convergence. And the reason that this is relevant is that what I'm finding is that the entire environment that we all work in is shifting. So it's much bigger context than just millennial generation becoming leaders. In fact, just to give you an example, I just recently had an interaction with Harvard Business Review in which I was suggesting an article for them about this very topic. And it was interesting, their response, because I did some research in their articles about millennials, and 2 or 3 years ago, they were writing articles on millennials. There's a number of articles that I've put on the resource page at the end here about the shift toward millennials as leaders and the way they're seeing the workplace differently. But today, when I interacted with the folks at Harvard Business Review, they said to me, you know, we're not going to use the term millennial anymore. Because what we're finding is that that's actually not so much the primary focus, that in fact everyone is changing the way they see the workplace, and that these demographic shifts are actually disappearing. And so the editor at Harvard Business Review said to me, we're finding that we are all millennials, which I thought was a really interesting phrase. That basically there's sort of a convergence of these shifts that are impacting all of us, and it's all coming together. So instant communications, removing barriers, not just for millennials, but for all of us. We're all now using email. We're all now on Facebook. We're all now texting, and more it's becoming just the norm to have direct communication. A couple of other examples, and it gets to the question that Stephanie raised, my fifth bullet there, the melding of the global, the local, the cultural, the racial, the national origin. So basically this whole idea of a melting pot. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, there was a conversation about like being global, but going local, and being aware of all the distinctions and differences. And I think that's still true. And yet, I know that in my clients here in New York City, I go in and I work with a team, and the whole definition of these distinctions is disappearing, because I look around the room and they're all global, they're all local, they're all culturally diverse, they're all racially diverse. They come from a multitude of different countries. I recently had a client where the executive team, I went to do a team coaching with them, and I was the only American in the room. The other 9 people were all from different countries. So in a sense, they were blending them all together. They were not losing their sense of cultural or national origin, but they were all blending. So anyway, this is just sort of a broader context in which I think there's a huge paradigm shift happening, and it's not just for millennials. So I raised that just to sort of keep it in the back of our minds.
And that actually you just addressed about 3 questions that came in, Jeff, with those thoughts. Thank you.
You want to give me any others, or shall I keep going?
No, I think you should keep going at this time. Thanks.
Okay. So before we move into the framework that my graduate students and I have created, I want to just give you some examples so that we can have in the back of our minds, and hopefully you're doing the same thing. As I go through this, I'd like to have you have in the back of your mind a millennial leader, or even a boomer or Generation X person. So I'm not necessarily saying that we're exclusively talking about millennials, but think about sort of the next generation of leadership and some examples of people that you've coached and how the framework of your narrative or the way you're working with them may have evolved. And that is what's hopefully going to lead us to be able to put this framework that I've created with my students into use. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all of these examples, but a couple of them, these are folks that I'm currently working with. So these are all real people. These are not the pictures of them. They would not be very happy if I used their real pictures. But just as examples of real clients. So the first one, current engagement I'm working with is a CEO of his e-commerce company, and he's maybe 32 years old. He is a Harvard Business School graduate, and he is very much an interesting combination of factors, very much a type A, driven, hardcore, directive type of leader. But on the other hand, he's a kind of classic millennial in that he was very open to coaching. He wanted all of his C-suite executives to have coaches. So, you know, he's already in some ways showing sort of a new paradigm approach to coaching. But as we'll see when we go through the framework, coaching for him has been somewhat confronting because it doesn't necessarily play to his tendency to be an autocratic leader. Another example is a woman who's a director of a nonprofit medical research supply company that I work with. They do very heavy-duty scientific research for many of the large pharmaceutical companies. They operate sort of at the intersection between the university, where there's academic research, and then the providers, the large pharmaceuticals. And this woman is a millennial also. She's in her late 20s and just recently into a director role. And she's what I would call the classic expert. So she's a PhD, she's an expert in her field of biostatistics, and she's struggling with how to manage a team where all of them are all experts. And this is another area that you run into with knowledge workers, where the hierarchy is really not what's running the organization because they're all super, super smart. They all have advanced degrees. They're all computer programmers or biostatistics. So it's been challenging for her to manage the group. And we've been working through some of her issues, and we'll get to that. Another example is someone also that's in a research world in the pharmaceutical environment. And this woman is also a director, but of the research herself. And she's an interesting case because she is actually a very soft-spoken, introverted, more of a quiet, laid-back kind of person. And if you've ever done the Myers-Briggs or the interpersonal leadership styles, she's a counselor type. So she's a very relational, but she's an expert in research. So she was the most obvious person to be the director or the senior manager of research. But she's finding it difficult to manage in the millennial framework. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Maybe I'll skip, we'll come back to some of these, but you get some of the sense of the examples of the type of individual that I'm personally running into that are younger, upstart managers in the millennial ranks that are not necessarily following the tried and true climb the corporate ladder kind of environment. Maybe I'll jump to the last one, who's covered on my screen, but I think you can see there's a CTO. So there's a chief technical officer also at an e-commerce engineering company that's struggling with being a millennial leader in an environment where he's trying to scale. So the company is growing very, very fast, and he's working through the paradigm shift of trying to develop a very creative, fast-moving, sort of artsy software group, very Maverick-style culture. But his boss is telling him to scale up and to be able to move in a more structured, traditional managerial format, which is sort of causing challenges for him because the size and scope of the group has become frustrating as he gets more and more structured. So scaling is an issue that a lot of the millennial leaders are challenged by. So those are some examples of real-life people that I want to keep in mind, and hopefully you're thinking of those that you're working with as we go along. I want to just spend a minute, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I thought it was valuable just to sort of frame the historical context as we think about post-heroic leadership, which is sort of this big umbrella that I'm using for the current frame of millennials in leadership roles. And I want to put this in a historical perspective, just briefly. So many of you that have been coaching for years are familiar, or studied leadership development, or trainers, are familiar with this sort of evolution of the way we viewed leadership over the last 50 years or so. So I think the thing that's most important to keep in mind about this slide is just the evolution of the primacy of the focus on the individual. So if you go back 100 years, if you go back to Frederick Taylor's work in the early 20th century, it was an evolution of work that had been done, Western civilization and so all of that. But the primary focus was on the character of the individual, right? And that there was this focus on a person being born a leader, charismatic, having particular traits or character. And that didn't really change much until 40s, 50s, 60s, when you have Blanchard comes along with situational leadership, and all of a sudden there's a shift in the paradigm in the 70s and 80s to start to begin to think about leaders in a setting, not just as the individual driver, but as a leader operating within a context. And that was really revolutionary when Blanchard came out with the situational leadership framework. And then another step forward, obviously, we're all familiar with Greenleaf's work around servant leadership. And where that became really valuable is it started to bring the idea of the follower into the context. So the dynamic between the leader and the follower starts to become more and more prevalent. And then eventually you move into the 90s and more up till today, and you begin to see that people like Lucia Cravani and Mary Ulbien are starting to talk about leadership more as a fluid, contiguous, adaptive, networked process. So there's been an evolution, I think we can all say, from the primary focus on the individual and the character traits of that particular person, to now we're situating the leader within a broader context. And those of you that are familiar with Barbara Kellerman's work, she's even gone further in saying that leadership itself is a system. You know, it's no longer about the person, it's about the system. And I just lost my slide, sorry about that. Finding the arrows here is difficult, Stephanie.
I think we're going the wrong way. There we go.
There we go. You know what happens is the arrows actually disappear on my slide. So I'm going to take a quick drink. Any questions or thoughts coming in?
Yeah, so someone is curious, how much of this thinking is based upon the mindset and bias the coach is bringing to the engagement?
Wow. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for us as coaches, right? Is to always keep in mind that whatever we are doing is impacting the way that the story is coming across for the client. So that's one of the reasons why I'm always cautious in using any kind of framework or assessment that you're bringing as a coach. You're bringing your own narrative into the dynamic. And, you know, as a coach, primarily our job is to explore and learn where the client is coming from and not impose our biases or our narrative or our opinion about what effective leadership is or isn't onto the client. So the more as coaches we can be aware of our own biases, the more we can be, and the more we can be honest and transparent with our clients, I think the more we can be effective as coaches. So it's a very, very good question. I think one of the things that as coaches we always have to do is our own work around any of these themes so that we are aware of whatever we're bringing into the client engagement and be willing to share that with the client. I know that many of my colleagues and I also bring in best practices. We share articles, we share resources with our clients, and I always caveat whatever I share with my clients that these are just, you know, they're not necessarily my personal opinion. They're research that may be useful, but that our goal as coaches is to help create an environment to evoke the values and what matters most from the client. Not sure that I answered the question, but
I think that was really helpful. Thank you.
That's a tough one. I lost my slide again. Hold on. Arrows back. So before we just jump in directly into post-heroic leadership, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning is just to bring up to date where we are with the science. I mean, one of the things that's been very exciting for me in working with the Institute of Coaching has been having access to these amazing resources, and the fact that there is so much more evidence-based research available to us that's now, it's been there all along in most cases, but it's now getting into the mainstream, and it's all available to us as coaches. So I'm not going to take the time to go through this entire list, but you can get a sense that as we work with our clients, that things like mindfulness, the evidence is now really irrefutable that mindfulness as a practice has a very direct impact on the performance and the optimal effectiveness of leadership. People that practice, whether it's meditation or Eastern types of mindful practices, Dan Siegel, Ellen Langer, and a number of other people have done research that demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that that impacts the presence and leadership effectiveness of people that are in these roles. Obviously, neuroscience is beginning to come to the forefront of our understanding of how we build engagement, how we build trust. People that are familiar with some of the discussions around oxytocin and the hormones that get released in the brain as we engage with other people are becoming more and more aware that the context in which you create an environment for interaction with other people impacts your brain directly, your mindset. The hormones that get released actually impact whether or not you feel trust, whether you feel engaged, whether you feel positive. So neuroscience is becoming more and more prevalent and more something that we can all look to as a firm foundation for creating connection with other people. Positive psychology, obviously, strengths-based research around self-authoring, looking at not so much psychopathology, but starting from a place of what works and using that as a foundation to explore and expand opportunities for people to become more effective and develop their own strengths. Emotional intelligence, obviously people are becoming more and more familiar with that as it becomes extremely well known and now sort of guiding many of us in our work with clients. And I'm not going to go through the whole list because I want to move on, but basically the idea that many of these scientific principles are now getting out into the mainstream, and they're forming the underpinnings of what I'm calling the framework for post-heroic leadership. So what is post-heroic leadership? Let's just jump right on here. Anything coming in, Steph?
A couple of questions, but I think we should keep going to see if we might answer them along the way.
Okay. So I want to say, first of all, that I did not coin this phrase post-heroic leadership. Excuse me. Post-heroic leadership has been around. There's some wonderful research that defines post-heroic leadership, and I have resources at the end of this presentation you'll find on the PowerPoint. So you'll be able to look up a couple of articles from Leadership Quarterly, which describe this in more detail. But basically, there are again, what I'm calling a confluence of everything that we've talked about or everything I've seen in the evolution of leadership theory, really culminating in this move beyond the individual as central to being part of a system, as Barbara Kellerman would say, evolution beyond patriarchy or beyond hierarchy. So it doesn't mean that there won't be structures that leaders will not find themselves in a hierarchical position at times, but the emphasis moves away from the patriarchal sort of power over kind of frame, that the leadership is more often shared and adaptive and fluid, moving back and forth between follower, leader, and collaborative partnering. One of my clients, the Human Rights Campaign, has decided to call all their leadership training co-powering. And it's been an amazing experience. Many of the leaders that I work with at the Human Rights Campaign are millennial leaders. They're from all over the country. They're all racially diverse, culturally diverse. And they get into a really exciting conversation about what does it mean to be co-powering as a leader. So the whole idea of sort of taking the hierarchy out of the conversation and taking collaboration to a whole new level. And then also becoming inclusive at a new level of inclusivity, where there's a heightened sensitivity around gender, around culture, and around race, but even beyond just seeing differences, but actually moving through to the next level of sameness. Of being welcoming beyond just like noticing and tolerating difference, but actually embracing difference. So ultimately, we're moving toward what I guess I would call a leader-follower dynamic where it's embedded inside a complex system. And then finally, just to no longer see the journey of the leader as so-called the hero's journey. And that doesn't mean that becoming a leader isn't in some ways still a journey of a heroic journey, right? We're all on our journeys as heroes. But I think that the paradigm that as a solo practitioner, your job is to climb the ladder and reach the pinnacle and then look out over the, you know, over the landscape as the hero is basically fading into the woodwork and becoming more the past than the future. So that's the broader context. Let me see if I can get this to work. Okay. So if that's our framework, if that's our context, then what I've worked with in my graduate classes with my millennial students is to have a dialogue with them. I've been working with them now for 4 years, and we've been sort of winnowing down the frame of what does it mean to be this adaptive, fluid, sort of flexible kind of leader. And the first thing I would say as we move through what I'm calling the post-heroic narrative or the post-heroic framework is two things. Number one, this framework can be used as an assessment. You can use it with your clients, and I have used it, but it's not a valid or reliable personality assessment. So it's very important that we contextualize that. This isn't a way of saying, you know, this is your particular style or you belong in this particular quadrant. Instead, it's really set up as a framework for encouraging a dialogue so that we have a conversation with leaders to discuss where they see themselves, like how they describe their comfort zone as a leader, or how other people may describe them. So this can also be used with a team where we have people sort of place each other on the spectrum. But most importantly, you're looking at moving back and forth. So it's not setting it up with a dichotomy where one side of the frame is better than the other, okay? So the framework starts on the left with what would be considered more traditional leadership competencies, and you'll see some of the things you might recognize from sort of the traditional patriarchal or normative paradigm to some of what I'm calling the new post-heroic paradigm. So we're going to walk through this real quickly and then hopefully have more of a dialogue about it. So there's 9 shifts or 9 dimensions, and on the left side you basically have 5 dimensions that focus on the self. So these are self-reflective ways of seeing yourself as a leader, and then when you move into the next 4, they're moving outward into leading others. Okay? And so you have type A, which I think everybody has a sense of what that means, shifting more toward type B, and the type B would be more the emotionally intelligent, present, more grounded, less directive, less authoritarian type leader. We'll get more into the details as we go into each of them. Vision versus presence, or vision moving toward presence. So vision is something that, of course, you never want to give up because being a visionary leader is certainly important. But the shift in the adaptive nature of the narrative is more towards presence, more towards aspiration and grounding in the here and now, as opposed to just being focused on the strategic analytical picture of the future. The next frame is a very straightforward shift from the I-based, ego-based focus of a leader to the we-based, or as Otto Scharmer in his presencing work, you may be familiar with, calls the eco-based frame. And another way of putting that is it's about social awareness. So thinking beyond the self to the other. Moving more into the ethical context, so clearly the traditional view would be judgment or ethics and having a sense of right and wrong and being very conscientious. Moving toward authenticity, which is beginning to not move so much away from judgment, but adding to it vulnerability and a sensibility of the subjective, nuanced sense of ethical decision-making. And then finally, knowledge to wisdom, and the shift here is primarily moving from a sort of facts-based, data-driven approach, rational approach, to more an inquisitive, questioning, nuance-based approach. And then we'll shift quickly into the leading others part of the framework, and you'll see that the idea of power becomes important. So power over is a traditional vein, right? Power over others, moving toward what I'm calling strength, which is self-authoring, and power with, getting back to that co-powering collaborative approach. And then the shift, interestingly enough, from productivity to creativity. And again, it's not an either or, because you need to have both. But for example, in my client where he's the CTO, he's challenged with building a productive environment, which is very focused on scale and structure and replicating processes, but also wants to have that creative mindset that Shelley Carson and Margaret Moore and others have developed around the work of creativity, which requires that fluidity and flexibility and even more childlike frame. So how do you maintain both of those, or how do you move back and forth between them? And then diversity to community, so diversity being obviously an awareness of difference, and we talked a little bit about that, and then the sensitivity around bias and cultural, racial, gender differences, to even moving beyond just a sensitivity and awareness to actually some of the unconscious bias and becoming more aware of what's underlying sort of the collective consciousness. And I'm going through this very quickly because I'm sensitive to time and I want to have some dialogue. But the final is the shift from teamwork, which is a more staid, structural approach to a team, to Amy Edmondson's work on teaming, which is moving us more toward a fluid, permeable, open kind of form of thinking about a team as not a siloed structure, but something that is open and has people kind of moving in and out. So more and more of my clients are reconfiguring teams so that they don't just have a competitive, like our team versus your team kind of mentality, but people move around and share leadership and also share participation in a variety of teams. So those are the 9 main frameworks, and I'm just going to show you how this actually moves into a framework where you can use it with clients. So these are some of the ways that we then define the different levels. So again, type A to type B, and you see how if you were working with a client, you would have them choose where they are on the spectrum naturally, where their comfort zone is, either in the middle, maybe more toward the A side, and then they could think about whether or not they're comfortable with that, whether or not they want to move, whether they want to shift the narrative for themselves, and then the question becomes, what does that look like? What does it take to move them from type A to, not that they necessarily want to be a type B type leader, or if they're a type B type leader like my director in the pharmaceutical research environment, where she was really more of a comfortable with the type B style, but thinking about what does it take to shift more toward being more decisive and directive and acting with more certainty at times, so to add that flavor to her sense of narrative and her capabilities.
Jeff, just one question around this.
Sure.
Someone was curious if the left-hand side you would kind of categorize that as not ideal, with the right-hand side as ideal. So I think if we could just get a little bit more clarity around the columns and how to think about those.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So the absolute answer to that is no.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why we keep this is not a frame of evaluation like A through 1 through 5 or something like that. The idea is not that anything on the left is better or worse from anything on the right. It's really more to develop a framework of adaptive leadership so that people can start to see the fluidity that they want to develop in their style. And for example, let me jump to the, I'll jump just as a good example. I'll jump to both. So the knowledge theme versus inquiry theme, right? The knowledge versus what I'm calling wisdom or nuanced, seeking questions. So this has been a useful frame for my expert client, the person who she prides herself on being very rigorous, being very data-driven, always looking to find a solution, and she's been trained. I mean, she's a scientist, so she's been trained to be very scientifically focused. But she's finding that in working as a leader, she also needs to have more nuance and have more ability to sort of sit with the questions. And it requires her to have more of an emotional intelligence, more empathy, and more nuance. And and surprise, surprise, what enters into the dialogue a lot around coaching is subjectivity. That not everything is objectively framed when you're doing leadership work. So for her, it's been very helpful that she put herself very close to the knowledge side in terms of her primary style, but she's been working toward moving toward fluidity and being more comfortable with being more nuanced, understanding the complexity of some of the like human resource issues that she's dealing with. So again, it's not that the left side is better or worse, but it's a frame for her to be thinking about. I'll give you one more example here with productivity and creativity. So this client of mine that runs a technology group, he really wants to keep up the creativity of his group, and he loves the fact that he has a lot of very entrepreneurial, chaotic kind of people who love to work in an environment where they're playful. They have basketball hoops all over their little section of the office. And they've had a lot of flexibility in developing their software and working all hours, working on the weekends. I mean, I think we've all sort of read about these kinds of environments where there's a lot of playfulness, and they have a really creative mindset. But the company is growing, and the CEO and CFO and other leaders are coming in and saying, hey, we need to be able to replicate the software. We need you to have some more focused results. We need you to be more goal-driven. We need you to get more ordered. We need to be grown-ups and all of that kind of thing. So the narrative that's kind of being thrust upon him is to be more focused on productivity. And what this has helped him see is that it's not an either-or dynamic. I mean, he can have both. But he needs to create an environment which supports those individuals that really work better in a creative, playful sense, and so he needs to keep that alive. And then he also needs to scale. So he needs people who are more structured, who are more analytical, and need a little more focused, more linear approach. So he's trying to find the balance between the two. So hopefully that answers the question. I definitely don't want to give the impression that one side or the other is better.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff.
And so that's the general framework. And I know I went through that really quickly. Anything else that's coming in?
We have a few more questions, but I think we might even want to try to open them up, Jeff, when it gets to a space where we could allow folks to maybe talk through some of their questions.
Oh, I'd love to do that. So let me just wrap up this section, and we'll have about 15 minutes to do some questions. And that question about like whether one side or the other is better is a really good segue to, again, I said, and I reiterate that as I developed this framework with my graduate students, we've worked through this. I've had a number of different sort of focus groups with the millennial leaders that are in the graduate program at NYU, and they struggled a little bit too with whether or not moving toward the right side was better, and they all want to be sort of type B leaders, which they think of as post-heroic. But really what they've discovered is that there are times when they need to be type A, they need to be visionary, they need to have the answers, they need to still have some of those more traditional control, command and control type energies. So the issue is not an either-or conversation, it's really a question of their identity. So that's why the coaching dynamic and, in fact, the classroom dynamic that I've been in with the millennial leaders is more about what goes on in that transitional space. Like, how do you develop as a leader so that when the environment gets particularly complex, when things are moving fast and you're kind of pushed and pulled in different directions, how do you gain that sense of fluidity How do you shift your mindset? I love Margaret's work around different mindsets. So how do you develop a fluidity of your approach to develop the agility both emotionally, intellectually, in your behavior, in your physicality, and to work within the context as a leader? And it often means, and this is sort of the punchline I think here, it often means becoming aware of where you may be somewhat attached to a preconceived notion of how you think you need to be as a leader. And it may require, that's where the opportunity is with a coach, to explore what's possible, to sometimes be directive, but also sometimes listen. So go back to my CEO example. It's been real eye-opening for my CEO of the startup who went to Harvard Business School, and I don't want to pick on Harvard because I love Harvard, but he's very highly trained to be directive and results-oriented and very energized, and he struggles with listening and being empathic and giving people space, taking a breath. This whole conversation with him around mindfulness has been almost shocking that he could find that type B leader within himself. So I'm going to leave it there and shift over to maybe a dialogue with you, Stephanie, but just to get a sense that I think as coaches our job is not to try to turn our type A CEOs into type B leaders, but I think it is to try to wake up our leaders and even the boomers that are maybe a little bit more set in their ways to see options, to see maybe they are particularly used to a way of being, a narrative about how they see themselves that sometimes works, but may not always be optimal. And the millennials among us are forcing the change. So there's the opportunity. It's coming fast and furious, and I think we have to be, as coaches, we have to be agile, and as leaders, we have to be awake to this. So I'm calling it like a tsunami because I think it's happening really, really quickly. So with that, I'm going to take a drink and...
Well, Jeff, maybe we could invite and see how this works, as we don't historically do this with our webinars, but see if anybody would like to raise their hand and I can unmute them because we have about 15 minutes left and it might offer us some space to try this out. So if anyone wants to put their hand up, I can unmute them. If they'd like to ask Jeff a question.
Hear from someone, and I know it's sometimes a little...
Okay. We have, I may mispronounce your last name, but Chris Paget. Chris, you are unmuted. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, I think this is just a fascinating conversation. I was thinking of what we're really coaching when we're working with leaders is range. So it's no different than working maybe with an artist in applying different mediums of art. So it's, different situations call for different types of leadership, and some leaders may be very skilled at one type of leadership, but it's coaching them to be able to be effective in different situations.
Perfectly said. I agree with you completely. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I think that's one of the reasons why I personally find this subject so exciting and the timing so exciting, because if you think back to my story of, if you can imagine, 20 years ago, I didn't have the opening with clients back then to bring in the subject of artistry and variation and variability that I think we have today. And so for me, it's just, it's exciting to really work with these young people. And I would have to say, a number of the boomers, I want to be careful that I don't come across as not being impressed with some of my boomer X or colleagues that I've worked with. So some of the Generation X and even boomer leaders are really jumping on the bandwagon, and they may be a little bit more stuck. I know I can be a little bit more stuck as a boomer, but I do find that there's one of the things that's true of boomers, and that's why I loved what Harvard Business Review editor said to me. We are all millennials. She said, don't use that phrase anymore. And I said, great, because there's an inner artist in all of us. And as a coach and working with my sometimes my boomer leaders, I love helping them make that connection between that creative artist within them and their leadership narrative. So thanks for that.
Great. Let's now hear from Travis Wilson. Travis?
Hi, Travis. Travis, are you there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was on mute myself. Forgive me. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. You were leading a bit, Jeff, into what the question I was going to ask, which is this, you've couched a lot of the discussion today around generational differences in the workplace, but where the shift that I'm hearing in what you're saying is, well, maybe it isn't so much generational. Maybe there's some other there's a societal evolution going on, a raising of consciousness that's leading to these changes in how we conceptualize leadership. So I guess I wanted to hear some more of your thoughts in terms of, is this a generations in the workplace thing, or is there something else going on that we may need to be attuned to?
It's a really, really good question, and I think that it gets back to the reason why I included a slide that I call the age of convergence, and I'll go back to it real quickly here. I think when I started doing this work, I was under the impression that it was a lot of what was happening in the leadership sphere was related to millennials. So the emergence of this very large cohort, the largest single generation since the boomers, was really beginning to impact the overall context in which leadership is being carried out. And then in talking with various colleagues and also with boomers that I work with, so I would have to say I still work with primarily leaders in the C-suite that are in their 40s and their 50s and sometimes even older. And I all of a sudden discovered that a lot of them were starting to feel the exact same kinds of shifts, that they're becoming more aware that they are connected 24/7 with their team, and that their team is spread out all over the world. They have people reporting to them in Romania and India and Ireland, that they're on 24-hour shifts, that they're no longer working a 9-to-5 day, that they are connecting through text messages, that there's a whole convergence of sort of the way we operate in our culture these days that has to do with shifts that are much bigger than just the millennials. I think the thing about the millennials that's interesting is they're comfortable with this change. I find that a lot of the boomers, including myself, are challenged by the change. I'll give you an example. I have a boomer leader who has multiple constituents or subordinates working for them in different time zones. Japan, India, Romania, in the US, and this individual has been really challenged with how to manage a virtual team. And we've done research together, we've explored some of the best practices, and then and they're working toward having more comfort with open space technology and using virtual webinar kinds of things, and having people at the lower levels of their organization be directly involved with each other and not having to always be in charge, and empowering the team. For example, empowering the team in Asia to just communicate with each other. That made the leader in the US very uncomfortable at first because they felt like they were a little bit out of the loop. So in contrast to that, I have an e-commerce company that's run mostly by millennials. And they also have a multi-racial, multicultural, multi-national origin team where they have people in a bunch of different countries, a bunch of different locations, and they have no problem with it. They're texting each other, they're sending emails to each other 24 hours a day, they all get together once a year, they think it's perfectly comfortable. So they're not as hierarchical in their view of the team. They have a rotating leadership where one person runs the team for 3 months and then they switch countries. So they have the Romanian manager run for 3 months, and then they have the person in Ireland run for 3 months, and then they shift over to India for 3 months. And I mean, in a way, as a coach, I've been learning from them that this idea of not having a hierarchy, of having a much more fluid, sort of adaptive, fast-moving environment, multicultural, multi-geography, is just absolutely comfortable for them. So to answer your question, I think it's both. I think there's a much bigger shift going on in our broader cultural landscape that I've mentioned and talked about a little bit, but I also think that the millennials are speeding it up. I think if nothing else, they're having a huge impact on how quickly the rest of us are being impacted by the shift.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
We have Kristen Hebler, and I'll just unmute her. Kristen, are you there?
Hi, I am. Thank you.
Hi, Kristen.
I really appreciate this framework. And one of the things I was thinking about was how it might be useful for helping a client think about understanding not necessarily just their own leadership style, but the broader organizational culture and how they may be fitting or not fitting into the culture of their organization. And I'm just curious if you've used it in that way as well.
You know, it's a really great question. In fact, I have not. So if any of you do this using this framework and maybe have the individuals evaluate themselves and then evaluate how they view the organization, that would be really great. I would be thrilled. You know, this PowerPoint will be available to all of you, and I can also send you the framework. So if you want to try it out with a team to have them evaluate both their organizational culture and then themselves as leaders and see where there's gaps or synchronicities or alignment, that would be really cool. What I have done is I've worked with, in my graduate classes, I have had the students evaluate themselves and then evaluate the place they work, which is pretty close to what you're talking about. And it definitely raises questions about like what kind of culture do we want to be versus what kind of culture we are. And the place where it really shows up is in the second set of dimensions around teamwork, productivity, creativity. I think a lot of the millennials that I've worked with, they have an aspiration to have a more fluid, teaming environment where there aren't as many barriers, there's less structure, it's more porous, people can work on multiple teams, there's a little bit more tolerance for mavericks and all of that, and then they find that the actual structure of the environment they work in, it's hard to implement that. It's not always easy to meet the goals, and the financial people come along and say, you know, it's great that you're so playful. But we have quarterly numbers we have to make, and what are your job descriptions? And you know, and I'll just say that the interesting paradox that I've experienced is that I started my career in HR 20 years ago when I ran into that difficult boss, and I shifted my career and I tried to become I became a psychologist so I could learn how to work with those kinds of folks. And that sometimes the HR department is one of the obstacles to this kind of flexibility. So, you know, the HR folks themselves are obviously very well intentioned, and they want to create an environment that optimizes engagement and obviously leadership effectiveness. But often I find that the HR structures are put in place to create, and they actually sort of unwittingly create a culture that's a little bit more siloed, structured. The feedback loops are not necessarily minute by minute, but annual, every 6 months. There's still traditional promotions. So all that to say that you know, some of the same old paradigm ways of operating are difficult to move around the cultural dynamics.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah. Great question, though. And if anyone out there has a chance to play with this framework with a team around values and culture, I think it would be really exciting to work with you. So let me know. So I notice we're getting toward the end here, Stephanie, and I just want to just leave you with the final slide that I'm not going to take the time to go through. For those of you that sometimes work with clients that are challenged with this transition toward being a leadership, toward being a more agile leader, I did add at the end of this PowerPoint what I use as sort of a framework for myself as a coach for 6 R's or 6 steps to work through with your client. And so this is available on the PowerPoint, and it's really just a framework for leadership agility that if anybody wants to follow up with me and have a little bit more interaction around that, I'm happy to do it. But this is there for you as a resource. There are a number of different change management models that a number of you, the GROW model, there are a lot of these models out there, but this is the one that I often use with my clients in this shift toward leadership agility. And then finally, on the last slide, that's also going to be available on the PowerPoint are some resources from Harvard Business Review, an article in Coaching World that I wrote about a year ago that sort of frames up this subject of post-heroic leadership, and then a couple of more academically oriented articles that really get deeper into the issue of leadership as collective construction, transformation around gender and power. So just resources for you to have available. And I think we're running out of time, Steph.
Fantastic. Well, this is great, Jeff. There are a few questions that remain unanswered, and if you don't mind, I'll send those to you after the close of the webinar with the addresses, and maybe you can respond to them over email. And of course, if any other questions come in, please feel free to contact Jeff or myself, and I'll make sure that Jeff receives them.
Yes,
and again, this webinar. Thank you, Jeff. And again, this webinar will be available with the slides on our website within the next day or two. So if you'd like to revisit it, you're more than welcome. And Jeff, I just want to thank you for being our guest presenter today. I have the luxury of working with you all of the time, but to also be a guest student was just an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone who joined us today, we thank you.
Well, it's been fun doing it, and I really appreciate all of your support too, Stephanie, over the years. So it's an opportunity to put a shout out to the great work that Stephanie does with the Institute, and it's been a pleasure to be with all of you, and I look forward to being in dialogue, so stay in touch.
Wonderful, and happy holidays to everyone. Take care.
You too. Take care.